This program is made possible through contributions to the WGCU Green Fund by Ding Darling Wildlife Society, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, Sanibel Captiva Community Bank.
There's a chill in the morning air. Dark water gently flows. Not a soul around anywhere. Just the birds in the mangroves.
Today, a low-key beach community of some 6,000 year-round residents and thousands of birds. Sanibel Island, Florida was headed for an entirely different fate in the 1960s. Back then, county officials and developers were hatching plans to build Sanibel out to full capacity, into a high-rise, highly commercialized tourist destination of 90,000.
It takes me back in time.
Everything was in the makings for Sanibel to become the next Miami Beach. And I think there's still pressure for that to happen. But the people that lived on Sanibel, they didn't want Sanibel to become the next Miami Beach. They didn't even want it to become Fort Myers Beach. So that's why we incorporated.
To take control of their island's destiny, islanders began a grassroots movement to investigate the possibility of home rule. In November 1974, by a vote of 689 to 394, they elected for incorporation.
The minute the city incorporated, we sort of put a moratorium on growth.
Next, city officials commissioned the Sanibel Report, on which it based its Sanibel Plan, a comprehensive land use plan that made history by making the environment priority one.
The Sanibel Plan requires us to live in harmony with nature.
A community guided by nature? It was unheard of at the time. What made Sanibel Islanders so far-sighted and ahead of their time environmentally?
Unique characteristics sort of inspired the conservationists, but the conservation leadership really started with J. Norwood Darling. It started in 1937, before there's really that language available to the rest of the country.
A man named Ding sounded the conservation alarm decades before the rest of the nation woke up to the ongoing depletion of natural resources. J. Norwood Ding Darling used his pen and political cartoons to raise awareness for half a century, from 1912 to 1962.
Ding Darling was the editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines Register. A lot of his editorial cartoons were conservation-oriented, where he railed against the destruction of our wildlife and our natural resources.
The syndicated cartoonist used the name Ding, a contraction of his last name, as his signature on hundreds of cartoons that led to 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He is also credited with creating the duck stamp program, designing the first duck stamp, and saving millions of acres of wetlands and other sensitive environment through the program. On Sanibel Island, Darling is revered for saving thousands of acres, ultimately almost a third of the island, from development, acreage that today bears his name as the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge, a crucial rest stop along a major bird migration flyway, hosts more than 220 avian species.
In the mid-30s, he visited Sanibel for the first time, and he was really struck with the beauty of the area.
The beauty Darling experienced was due in part to the efforts of an earlier conservation-minded figure, President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1908, he declared 3 refuges and waters surrounding Sanibel Island and its sister island to the north, Captiva.
Pine Island and Matlacha Pass and Island Bay National Wildlife Refuges were established in 1908. They were established by executive order of President Theodore Roosevelt to protect a breeding colony of birds at each of those refuges.
The birds needed protection because man could not be left to slaughter the birds. The federal government had the means necessary, working with the Audubon Society and its wardens, to protect the birds from the slaughter of men who would profit simply by their feathers and by the fact that women enjoyed wearing dead birds and feathers in their hats. It was a silly thing, and it needed the intervention of the federal government.
Roosevelt was also a founding officer of the Florida Audubon Society, which came into existence in 1900 to save the birds.
And then in 1916 we had our visit here, and I did some great devilfish hunting in what is now known as Roosevelt Channel, off the coast of Captiva Island, and had bully fun too.
Ding Darling eventually built a home on Captiva Island and immediately began campaigning for preservation of Sanibel's freshwater wetlands. The island is one of a few in Florida to claim a freshwater slough known today as the Sanibel River, which is responsible for the island's alligator population.
Those freshwater wetlands are one of the keys to Sanibel's unique environmental characteristics, and that is that with that fresh water you have a greater diversity of plants and a greater diversity of wildlife. River otters and bobcats, those sorts of things couldn't live without fresh water.
Always the aggressive letter writer, Darling penned a missive to the chief of the Division of Wildlife Refuges in 1942, urging immediate action on preserving Sanibel's wetlands.
My reason for counseling against delay is that Florida's in the midst of a land boom, and there are always, under such circumstances, hungry land sharks who go around trying to pick up anything and everything they can, put in the pot to brew their stinking broth. Yours very truly, J.N. Darling.
He was very straightforward. He didn't deal in shades of truth. It was either black or it was white, and he didn't mind telling you which he thought it was.
In the early 40s, he became aware of the proposal by the state of Florida to sell over 2,000 acres of state-owned lands to developers here on Sanibel. And he convinced the governor, Spencer Holland, at that time, to postpone those sales, and eventually convinced the state to create a state wildlife sanctuary. And following that, he was able to eventually convince the Truman administration to establish this area as a national wildlife refuge, and at that time it was called Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge, established in 1945.
Up on the Sanibel Refuge has had spectacular results. The tropical birds, including all varieties, come there in great numbers for the food and fresh water. I have seen as many as 2,000 wood and white ibis on the refuge at one time.
Islanders who had supported Darling's efforts were ecstatic. Darling appointed his friend Tommy Wood as manager of the new refuge, a man whom, by all reports, was quite a character and devoted entirely to wildlife. Charles LeBoeuf later became Wood's staff of one, stationed at the Sanibel Lighthouse, which the refuge then owned.
In 1960, I was fortunate that Ding Darling and his wife came back to Captiva for their last visit. And I had the opportunity to meet Ding Darling twice. And during our first meeting, it was in the office at the refuge at the lighthouse, and we got talking with Tommy Wood, the refuge manager, and myself, and Ding Darling about sea turtles. And Ding Darling's had a real gut interest in conservation, not only waterfowl and wetlands, but also in sea turtles. He and Tommy charged me to do something about sea turtles on Sanibel and Captiva because the mortality from just raccoons alone was really devastating in those early days.
The herons dance the bird ballet.
Darling opened the doors to a unique Sanibel conservation ethic, and just in time. The completion of the Sanibel Causeway in 1963 opened the floodgates to the island. After Darling's death in 1962, Tommy Wood, the local Audubon Society, and other Ding supporters formed a committee to have the refuge renamed after him.
When Darling passed away, people on a national scale wanted some sort of memorial to him, and people on a local scale wanted some way of remembering him. For the next 5 years, the national group, which was the Ding Darling Foundation, and the small group here, the Ding Darling Memorial Committee, worked to bring about a land use acquisition plan for the refuge. And also, it took them 5 years to convince Congress that they could actually name a refuge for a person. They had never been named for a person before.
Once it achieved its goal in 1967, The Ding Darling Memorial Committee incorporated into the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation.
One of the key pushers of conservation on this island that's sort of forgotten was Roy Bezier. Roy Bezier was one of the founders of the Sandcap Conservation Foundation, their first executive director, and was a staunch supporter of conservation.
The foundation, which came to be known as SCCF, began aggressively soliciting for private contributions to buy up sensitive land on the islands while supporting refuge operations. Developers were eyeing 256 acres to subdivide into 1,000 lots in developments to be named Tarpon Bay and Sanibel Gardens. The developments would have engulfed the 102-acre Bailey Tract, a satellite campus of the Ding Darling Refuge.
Darling insisted that that duck stamp money be used only for land acquisition for wildlife habitat. And the Bailey Tract was one of those freshwater wetland parcels of land that in the later part of Darling's life, he was able to wrangle some of the congressional monies for land acquisition of the Bailey Tract.
Bezier and his cohorts jumped into action, persuading landholders in the Sanibel Gardens development to sell their lots to SCCF, especially after hearing the county's plan to build an offshore highway through refuge lands. Today, the acreage bears the SCCF logo among more than 30 preserved tracts on and around Sanibel and Captiva, purchased by private funding. The city also owns land earmarked for preservation, thanks to that early Sanibel plan.
When it all got sorted out, the best tool that we had to preserve the conservation ethic here and to give it an opportunity to flourish was to incorporate.
Through groundbreaking legislative measures, the city of Sanibel brought a halt to rampant development, later governing it with its pioneering rate of growth ordinance.
We said, no, this is going to be a small government, it will always be, and the purpose of it is to protect the quality of life here through legal land use planning and zoning.
Feeding alligators became a tremendous problem on the island. Alligators in some respects were threatening people, so to prevent the interaction between humans and alligators, I drafted an ordinance and the city council passed it where we prohibited feeding alligators on Sanibel.
That city law later became the model for state legislation. LaBeouf had already formed Coretta Research in 1968 to protect the endangered sea turtles that nest on island beaches. Its influence reached well beyond Sanibel.
We had 17 units along the southwest Florida coast.
Other wildlife protection agencies organized after the causeway opened. In 1968, one woman's concern for birds injured on the causeway led to the formation of CROW, which today stands for the Clinic for the Rehabilitation of Wildlife, one of Florida's first such animal hospitals.
I operated out of my backyard, so to speak, till about 1975. I had probably, at one time, I had about 40-some pelicans. I would have owls and hawks and crows and seagulls, just all manner of critters there.
The Sanibel Captiva Audubon Society, which had formed in 1953, also actively petitioned for the welfare of birds and other island wildlife.
The speed limit in 1960 was 65 miles an hour on Sandcap Freeway. As you know, it's 35 now officially, and we try to discourage people from going anything more than that. But Audubon was able to document the demise of the critters along that freeway, so to speak. And again, by doing good science, even locally, we were able to stop the destruction of the animals along the Sandcap Road on the way to the refuge.
Audubon members acted as the original volunteer rovers along the refuge's wildlife drive, policing and educating visitors. Those efforts ultimately evolved into the Ding Darling Wildlife Society, one of the first National Wildlife Refuge Friends groups in the nation.
They have been very instrumental in advancing the educational goals of the refuge, and in fact, this is probably the most active and largest contributing friends group that we have in the country.
Sanibel owes a debt of gratitude to people such as Darling, Bezier, and Willis and Opal Coombs, who actually once stood off a bulldozer with a crossbow. Many other environmental heroes followed in their footsteps.